Episode 20. I think we ought to have passports or something, Calvin suggested. This is much more than leaving America to go to Europe. And that boy and the woman both seem to care so much about having things in proper order. We certainly haven't got any papers in proper order.
If we needed passports or papers, Mrs. Whatsit would have told us so,
Charles Wallace said. Calvin put his hands on his hips and looked down at Charles Wallace. Now look here, old sport. I love those three old girls just as much as you do, but I'm not sure they know everything.
They know a lot more than we do.
Granted. But you know Mrs. Whatsit talked about having been a star. I wouldn't think that being a star would give her much practice in knowing about people. When she tried to be a person, she came pretty close to goofing it up. There was never anybody on land or sea like Mrs. Whatsit, the way she got herself up.
She was just having fun, Charles said. If she'd wanted to look like you or Meg, I'm sure she could have.
Calvin shook his head. I'm not so sure. And these people seem to be people, if you know what I mean. They aren't like us, I grant you that. There's something very offbeat about them, but they're lots more like ordinary people than the ones on Uriel. Do you suppose they're robots? Meg suggested. Charles Wallace shook his head.
No. That boy who dropped the ball wasn't any robot, and I don't think the rest of them are either. Let me listen for a minute.
They stood very still, side by side, in the shadow of one of the big office buildings. 6 large doors kept swinging open, shut, as people went in and out, looking straight ahead, paying no attention to the children whatsoever. Charles wore his listening, probing look.
They're not robots, he said suddenly and definitely. I'm not sure what they are, but they're not robots. I can feel minds there. I can't get at them at all, but I can feel them sort of pulsing. Let me try a minute more.
The 3 of them stood there very quietly. The doors kept opening and shutting, and the stiff people hurried in and out, walking like jerky figures in an old silent movie. Then, abruptly, the stream of movement thinned. There were only a few people, and these moved more rapidly, as if the film had been sped up. One white-faced man in a dark suit looked directly at the children, said, "Oh dear, I shall be late," and flickered into the building. "He's like the White Rabbit," Meg giggled nervously.
"I'm scared," Charles said. "I can't reach them at all. I'm completely shut out."
"We have to find Father," Meg started again.
"Meg," Charles Wallace's eyes were wide and frightened. "I'm not sure I'll even know Father. It's been so long, and I was only a baby."
Meg's reassurance came quickly. "You'll know him. Of course you'll know him. The way you'd know me, even without looking, because I'm always there for you. You can always reach in."
"Yes."
Charles punched one small fist into an open palm with a gesture of great decision.
"Let's go to Central Intelligence."
Calvin reached out and caught both Charles and Meg by the arm. "You remember when we met, you asked me why I was there? And I told you it was because I had a compulsion, a feeling I just had to come to that particular place at that particular moment." "Yes, sure. Well, I've got another feeling. Not the same kind, a different one. A feeling that if we go into that building, we're going into terrible danger." Chapter 7. The Man with Red Eyes.
"We knew we were going to be in danger," Charles Wallace said. "Mrs. Whatsit told us that."
"Yes, and she told us that it was going to be far worse for you than for Meg and me, and that you must be careful. You stay right here with Meg, old sport. Let me go in and case the joint and then report to you."
"No,"
Charles Wallace said firmly.
She told us to stay together. She told us not to go off by ourselves.
She told you not to go off by yourself. I'm the oldest, and I should go in first. No. Meg's voice was flat. Charles is right, Cal. We have to stay together. Suppose you didn't come out and we had to go in after you. Come on. But let's hold hands, if you don't mind. Holding hands, they crossed the square. The huge Central Intelligence Building had only one door, but it was an enormous one, at least 2 stories high and wider than a room, made of a dull bronze-like material. Do we just knock? Meg giggled. Calvin studied the door. There isn't any handle or knob or latch or anything. Maybe there's another way to get in.
Let's try knocking anyhow, Charles said.
He raised his hand, but before he touched the door, it slid up from the top and to each side, splitting into 3 sections that had been completely invisible a moment before. The startled children looked into a great entrance hall full of dull, greeny marble. Marble benches lined 3 of the walls. People were sitting there like statues. The green of the marble reflecting on their faces made them look bilious. They turned their heads as the door opened, saw the children, looked away again.
Come on,
Charles said, and, still holding hands, they stepped in. As they crossed the threshold, the door shut silently behind them. Meg looked at Calvin and Charles, and they, like the waiting people, were a sickly green. The children went up to the blank 4th wall. It seemed unsubstantial, as though one might almost be able to walk through it. Charles put out his hand.
It's solid and icy cold.
Calvin touched it too. Ugh! Meg's left hand was held by Charles, her right hand by Calvin, and she had no desire to let go of either of them to touch the wall.
Let's ask somebody something.
Charles led them over to one of the benches.
Could you tell us what's the procedure around here?
He asked one of the men. The men all wore nondescript business suits, and though their features were as different one from the other as the features of men on earth, there was also a sameness to them. Like the sameness of people riding in a subway, Meg thought. Only on a subway, every once in a while, there's somebody different, and here there isn't. The man looked at the children warily. The procedure for what?
How do we see whoever's in authority? Charles asked.
You present your papers to the A machine. You ought to know that, the man said severely.
Where's the A machine? Calvin asked.
The man pointed to the blank wall. But there isn't a door or anything, Calvin said. How do we get in? You put your S papers in the B slot, the man said. Why are you asking me these stupid questions? Do you think I don't know the answers? You'd better not play any games around here, or you'll have to go through the process machine again, and we don't want to do that. We're strangers here, Calvin said. That's why we don't know about things. Please tell us, sir, who you are and what you do. I run a number 1 spelling machine on the 2nd grade level.
But what are you doing here now?
Charles Wallace asked. I am here to report that one of my letters is jamming, and until it can be properly oiled by an F-grade oiler, there is danger of jammed minds.
Strawberry jam or raspberry?
Charles Wallace murmured. Calvin looked down at Charles and shook his head warningly. Meg gave the little boy's hand a slight, understanding pressure. Charles Wallace, she was quite sure, was not trying to be rude or funny. It was his way of whistling in the dark. The man looked at Charles sharply. I think I shall have to report you. I'm fond of children due to the nature of my work, and I don't like to get them into trouble, but rather than run the risk myself of reprocessing, I must report you.
Maybe that's a good idea, Charles said. Who do you report us to?
To whom do I report you?
Well, to whom then? I'm not on the 2nd grade level yet.